Well, let's get more reaction now on the recent classification of foodborne illnesses, a disaster. We speak to the Emeritus Professor of Pulmonology at the University of Witwatersrand, Professor Guy Richards. Professor, good afternoon to you and thank you very much for your time. Firstly, let me start with the question around what, in your mind, does it mean when government declares this particular crisis a national disaster? What do you think the plan in place ought to be?
Well, I need to go back one step. First of all, there's a semantic issue here in terms of it being called a foodborne illness. Now, this implies that it has been contaminated by an organism, usually bacteria, but occasionally viruses, that will accumulate in spoiled or elderly food.
Yeah.
In other words, we see a lot of interviews looking at expiry dates on food. Here we are talking about a chemical contaminant which has been placed into the food. Now, it's different from a foodborne illness, and a product which has passed its sell-by date does not suddenly develop this chemical inside the actual foodstuff.
Right.
It has to actively be placed into that foodstuff in its manufacture. Now, yes, it is a disaster because so many people have died as a consequence. And what one really needs to do is to go back to the source or the origin of these foodstuffs to find out where this contamination is taking place. It's a most unusual thing because when it's talking about carbamates, or in fact a variant or a type of organophosphate, which kills by causing paralysis. And it would need to be directly in contact with the foodstuff prior to its packaging, or that it would have to be extensively placed or seen on the outside of the packets such that the children might absorb this toxin through their skin rather than in fact ingesting it. But to me, it's a very strange situation that the foodstuffs are being contaminated prior to their consumption.
Professor, it's a very interesting way that you are describing this, because what essentially you are saying is that the framing around this being a foodborne illness is actually wrong, because this is a chemical that has been placed near foodstuffs and therefore contaminating the food. So is government wrong in framing it this way? Should there be a revision around that?
Yes, I believe so, because now people are going out and looking in spaza shops to see if the food stuff is beyond the sell-by date, and that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant in the vast majority of cases, unless it's obviously spoiled inside. And even then, that chemical does not form in a spoiled foodstuff. There you would be contaminated or infected by things like E. coli, Staphylococcus, Salmonella. There are many bacteria and organisms that would give you food poisoning. This you need to look at as to how a chemical is getting inside a packet of a foodstuff. I mean, it's either that people are manufacturing packets of these toxins in the same room together with the manufacturer of the food, which then somehow is allowing this chemical toxin to be actually placed in the foodstuff that they're mixing or making at that time.
So are you intimating, Professor, that this could be something that is deliberately done in order to, to achieve what exactly?
I would be horrified if that were the case. I mean, the number of deaths that have occurred is enormous, but you have to consider somehow that this potentially could be being introduced somehow into the actual food chain. I would hesitate to say that it's intentional, but it has to be explained as to how this chemical is getting into the foodstuff so that the kids can eat it.
It's quite an interesting conversation that you and I are having, Professor, because on the one hand, we are saying that the framing around it is wrong, and I absolutely accept what you are saying. I get you. The other point now that we have just made is that could this be intentional? I want to go back to what the government said. It must have been a week or two before, and they said that this represented a possible threat to national security. Do you think that they may know something we don't, and they possibly are not saying it in order to not cause alarm?
Well, I also don't want to cause alarm, but I mean, it obviously is a possibility, because you are somehow taking this highly toxic chemical and placing it in foodstuff, which is then being distributed. How does it get in there? And who in their right mind would be mixing foodstuffs at the same time as mixing up pesticides that are so toxic? It's a horrible thought.
And you and I think, are justified in being ponderous in the way that we are, because just yesterday, a warehouse was discovered in KwaZulu-Natal, and it is packed with expired foodstuffs. This is foodstuff that is not coming from South Africa, it's imported. The police confirming that they are aware of the countries from which these products come. They just won't say it now because it perhaps is going to have to wait for court processes. What are we learning here, Professor, if we, as one late government official liked to say, if we try to join the dots?
Well, the warehouse with the expired products is not or cannot in itself result in chemical poisoning with a carbamate or organophosphate. That would have to be placed into those packets before they or during their manufacturing process. So you would have to check to see whether any of those products actually contained the chemical already. So that's where one would need to be looking at these packets. The actual expiration date, as I said before, is not really relevant, because that does not cause a chemical to form inside that packet.
All right. So, to your mind, Professor, how should this be investigated in a manner that satisfies all? What are the origins of this? What could potentially be the intention here, if indeed at some point we discover that this was deliberately mixed into foodstuffs? And you are the professor of pulmonology. I don't know what that means in the first place. You may have to explain this, how it ought to be investigated.
So it actually is, I'm an emeritus professor of pulmonology, that's chest medicine and critical care. Yeah. So we dealt with a lot of these poisonings that were either intentional, suicide, or that people were poisoning somebody intentionally as well. In adults, we dealt with them, but they never occurred as a consequence of ingestion of foodstuffs at the time. So my feeling is that going around to spaza shops and looking for expired products is a waste of time. One has to determine which spaza shop was involved, and then you have to trace back to find out where that foodstuff came from and where it was manufactured. Yeah. And then within that manufacturing process, you have to find out, is there some possible way that these chemicals could have been introduced into the foodstuff prior to its distribution to that specific spaza shop? But looking for expired goods alone is a waste of time.
This is a pesticide that is involved, and I think government has been quite clear that no one is allowed now to come into contact with that unless it is done so professionally, and this is stuff that is going to be monitored very closely. This pesticide, how easy or difficult do you think it is going to be to get rid of it from the hands of those who know know better about handling such?
It's going to be extremely difficult because they have been introduced illegally across our borders for many years. The original one was known as aldicarb, and the actual manufacturer stopped making it because of the actual potential toxicity when getting into the wrong hands. And then it started to be made illegally and brought in and sold, often even on taxi ranks and places like that, as a black powder in a bank bag, and then sold as two-step, which you take 2 steps and you die, or there are other street names or colloquial names that are utilized for it as well.
Yeah.
Now, already, if it is coming across illegally, you would then have to catch it at the border or wherever it's coming across, because people are buying it as an extremely effective pesticide by causing paralysis, which is what it does to humans as well. And when you become paralyzed, you're no longer able to breathe, and that is the primary cause of the death that occurs acutely. So there are lots of other symptoms, but what kills you is the paralysis that is caused by this agent.
Yeah. I'm out of time, Prof. I want to ask this question. Why is it that this is so deadly to children? Do you think adults are possibly able to deal with it better in terms of, I guess, their immune system that is much more advanced?
No, everybody is susceptible. The only point is that if you've got a small body, you will require a lesser amount to have the same effect. So adults require slightly more because they're bigger. But let me tell you, we see hundreds, or have seen hundreds, of these cases in adults. And we keep them in the ICU and on a ventilator for prolonged periods of time, breathing for them. Wow. Because of the paralysis that has been caused by this chemical agent.
My goodness. Emeritus Professor of Pulmonology and Critical Care at the University of Witwatersrand, Guy Richards, thank you very much for your time and insights here. Quite an insightful conversation it has been. Thanks indeed, Professor.